Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The United Kingdom of Israel, Foreshadowing the Reign of Christ the King. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 15 of our study, which covers the second book of Samuel, chapters 11 and 12. So up till now, things have been going exceedingly well for David as king. He did have sort of a rough patch with Saul and coming to be named king, when he had to run around for a while, and it was not super ideal. But at this point, he's had quite a while as king, and things have been going very well for everyone involved, for him and for the people. So, good job. Springtime comes, which apparently is fighting season, whether you need to or not. So the army goes out to do some fighting, and David decides to stay home. It's unclear whether that was just how these military things were going at this point, or whether he kind of pick and chose and sometimes went, sometimes didn't. But at any rate, David is staying home, and his time as such is not 100% occupied by matters of state. So one day he is out walking around outside in the palace, and he sees a woman bathing who is extremely beautiful, and so he calls somebody over and says, "Hey, isn't that the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" They say, "Oh, yep, that is, yep." And he says, "Cool, bring her here." And then he has sex with her, and we find out later that she becomes pregnant. So that's a little less awesome in terms of behavior of the king. Adultery is not high on the list of things that God's a huge fan of. So David has done something wrong, and we will get to see how that plays out. David's next recourse, now that he has committed adultery and the woman with whom he committed it is pregnant, is to seek for a way to explain by normal and allowed means the pregnancy of Bathsheba. So he calls her husband Uriah the Hittite back from the field under the pretense of asking him how things are going in the battle. And then he says, "Well, while you're here, you can go back tomorrow, but you should just chill here tonight," thinking Uriah would go back to his house and would also lay with his wife, and that then there would be a very reasonable explanation for the fact that she is pregnant. But Uriah, being the soldier that he is, takes the position that, well, if the guys I'm out in the field with and my commanders and everybody aren't getting to sleep in beds tonight in their houses, then why should I? And he slept out with servants on the ground. So David, being a little annoyed, calls him back in the next day and says, "Hey, I noticed you didn't go home last night." And he said, "Yeah, I can't do that while everybody is that I'm serving with and the army isn't." So very commendable behavior, by the way, on the part of Uriah. Seems like an extremely dedicated soldier and a guy you would want to have on your team. And so David has another plan. "Okay, I know what I'll do. I'll get him drunk. Then he'll definitely want to go home." And so David invites him to dine with David the king. Not exactly an invitation you can pass up. And serves wine liberally at the meal. Uriah does, in fact, become intoxicated, but he still doesn't go home to his wife. And so now David has to move on, unfortunately, to plan B. Which we will see what that is. But plan A, cover up the fact that there was adultery by getting the husband to think that he's the father and everybody will be fine. Didn't work. So David's first plan here to get out of as much as possible this unfortunate situation his transgression has created for him hasn't worked. Uriah, being back in town, would not go home and sleep with his wife. So now David does something even worse, which is he sends Uriah back to the battle, and he sends him with a note for Joab, the commander, that says, Joab, here's what you do. I want you to put Uriah where the fighting is the worst, and then when he's engaged, back everybody else off, and make sure that he dies. Which is exactly what happens. And so Uriah dies in battle. Joab sends back the battle report, and sounds like probably Uriah is not the only one who died in executing this particular maneuver either. But clearly Joab knows this is normally the kind of battle report David would not be pleased about getting, and would send back and would rage about, what were you doing? You should know better, blah, blah, blah. And so Joab makes sure to amend to the bottom of the report, or to have mentioned when David reacts the way he probably correctly knows he will, to mention once David said his piece that Uriah the Hittite is also dead, so that David can figure out, yeah, I did this, but I did it because you told me to, David. So here we are. And so Uriah is dead. So the message Joab has sent via messenger arrives to David. It goes pretty much exactly as Joab thought it would. Initially, David is not so happy, but when he gets to the part at the end, he says, these things happen. Don't worry about it. It's the cost of doing business. Which shows us, I think, as much as anything, how much this sin has hardened David or caused him to overlook his own role in what's happening. His ability to just casually brush off the death of people who incredibly loyally followed him just so he could get out of the mess that he got himself into. And then we also hear that the wife of Uriah the Hittite, after the appropriate mourning period, becomes David's wife. And just as an added bonus, and the thing that will shape how all of this plays out from here on, that God is displeased, which is not surprising, but it's probably not a position David is used to being in with regards to the Lord. But he has definitely displeased the Lord in this. So we've just seen David has displeased the Lord. And so now what happens when the Lord is displeased with the king? He sends a prophet. So Nathan gets a mission to go and to talk to David. I think it's very interesting psychologically how God and Nathan go about communicating with David here. They don't just dive right in and say, hey David, you screwed up and we have a problem. They go about it in terms of, hey David, I want to tell you a story. One story is, there's a rich guy with lots of stuff and a poor guy with almost nothing, and the rich guy takes his stuff. What do you think about that? And David rightly says, I think that guy deserves to die, or should at least give back what he took fourfold. And he flies into something of a rage at just at the idea of such a horrible thing. This highlights how sin affects us psychologically. Seeing this situation external to himself, David thinks this is totally not okay and not acceptable. But as he's been going along every step of the way, as he's been doing things, he keeps thinking, I guess I have to, because this is where I am. And he keeps digging himself in deeper and deeper and doing worse and worse things, and never registering the full scope and significance of the wrongdoing that he is committing, to the point that what happens in the story is way less than what David has done, and he's so mad about that. And the poor man in the story isn't killed. So God and Nathan seem to be using this example to help kind of shock David out of the numbness or the dullness or the complacency that his sin has led him into. Because ultimately, in his heart, David is a good guy who loves God, who just fell into something really bad. Which is not to say that if you're fundamentally a good guy and you love God, then you can go around committing adultery and murder and have that be okay. Not okay, but I guess now we get to see how David chooses to deal with this as the situation unfolds. So Nathan began this interaction with David by telling him a little story, and now he says, "You're the bad guy in the story, David. You know, the one you just thought deserved to die and he was so bad. That's you. Let's summarize what you did. You slept with somebody's wife and then you had him killed to avoid the inconvenience of that coming out. So bad on you. And by the way, you did this after God did what things for you? Oh yeah, you were a shepherd, and now you're a king, and Saul wanted to kill you all those years, and he kept that from happening. And look at everything he's given you. You're king of Judah and Israel, and you have all of this, all given to you by God, and you have tons of wives and lots of stuff, and you still did this. What gives? So, here's what's going to happen, and it's not going to be awesome. First of all, because you acted in violence in this way, the sword will never depart from your house. There will always be conflict. I'm going to raise up, in fact, against you someone from your own house. And you know how you did this thing in secret. There's going to come a time where your wives are given very publicly to other people. And that's going to be not awesome for you. And so, welcome to the consequences of your sin. And God is not pleased. It's kind of where Nathan leaves the initial summary of the problem that David has found himself in. So, Nathan has explained from the point of view of God the wrongdoing that David has committed. Now we see David's response, which is really what will tell us everything about who David is. And David responds very briefly by just acknowledging, yep, I've sinned. Not, oh, but God, you didn't see her. She was so hot. Or, but, you know, if I hadn't killed Uriah, then people would have found out that I committed adultery and they would have stoned her and maybe me, and it would have been so bad. You had to be there. He did not rationalize or try to explain away what he did. He just said, yep, I have sinned. I did that. And so then, note, Nathan has withheld the full extent of God's judgment on the core issue, are you David or are you not going to die, until after David's response. Where when David acknowledges his sin, then Nathan says, yep, that's right, you did. Guess what? God's going to spare your life. But the son that you had with Bathsheba, the child is going to die as a result of your sin. And that is, events transpire, the child gets sick, David prays diligently for the child for 7 days, he fasts, he mourns, he pleads with God, and on the seventh day, the child dies. The idea of 7 is, although it would not have been any comfort much at all to David at this point, is important from a biblical point of view. Usually when you see a 7, it is a repeating pattern suggesting as you finish 1 week of 7 days, you then start another one and something else comes after. The idea that the child died on the 7th day suggests that there will be another one as well. So David entreats and pleads with God to spare the life of the child, but God does not relent. The consequences of sin remain. Just as Uriah the Hittite can't be made undead, or not dead, I guess is not the same as undead in English, as you can't unmurder Uriah the Hittite, the guilt that lingers with that and the need for a life to be taken in exchange for the life owed in the sin committed happens. And so David's son dies. And that's where we are right now. So David's servants have been afraid to tell David that his child is actually dead. Because he's been so distraught and mourning, they're afraid that David will actually do some sort of harm to himself when he learns that the child is dead. But he overhears them talking, and he finds out. And then his reaction surprises, seems like basically everybody who sees it. And this is a thing that potentially, and hopefully for us as Christians, doesn't seem unusual, David's behavior, but at the time it was. Which is when he hears, I mean, it was and wasn't. I'm not trying to say he should look cheery and go about his normal business when his child died. Which is what he does, is he does all of his mourning and pleading prior to the death of the child, thinking maybe God can do something. And then afterwards he says, well, God didn't. I tried, and now I'm going to, not be sad, but go about my business. There's nothing to plead with God for anymore. I already tried that and he didn't answer. So let's get back to what needs to be done. Let's move on. We have seen that David's son has died, and he has embraced that that's true. He pleaded with God to try to resolve it, but afterwards he reasoned God did not bring him back. He's dead now. Nothing can be done. So I'll move on, which is interesting from the point of view of foreshadowing, because of course when God's own son dies, he does come back, which is exactly the thing here. David is saying, now that he's dead, nothing can be done. I can go to where he is, but he can't come back to where I am. And that is exactly what Jesus does. But Jesus is not David's son, born out of adultery. Slightly different circumstances there. But it is interesting to think of the contrast between God and David in this regard, where God is able to deliver his own son, of whom he also requires the life, also as a result of sin, but in that case not God's sin, but ours. So lots of parallels worth thinking on. At any rate, David goes and comforts his wife Bathsheba, and they have another son. And this one, the Lord loves. And it is Solomon. And not to overspoil anything, but I think probably most people who would be willing to be involved in a Bible study like this probably know that Solomon eventually becomes king. It kind of comes up quite a bit. So this is the one who becomes king after David. We'll all get to see that, how that happens. But it raises a very interesting question, which is, what did God have in mind for David's household? Because Solomon, again, spoiler alert, doesn't necessarily do the best job of following God the same way his father David did. And he would not have existed if David hadn't committed adultery and then murder. And so what could have happened is the thing we never really get to know the answer to when sin enters into the picture. What could have been if I had done it the way God wanted instead of doing the thing that I thought I wanted to do? What could have been for the people of Israel instead of what happens with Solomon and after if David had not committed that transgression? That we don't get to ever know. All we get to do is deal with what remains for us. But when we're thinking about whether or not we should do what God wants, that's the thing to think about. Once it all turns to crap, we never get to know what God had in mind otherwise. And it could have been pretty awesome. So we have, to the best that it can be done after the fact, resolved the issue of David's sin. God is not killing David. David has another son, Solomon. There's going to be violence in David's household and bad things are coming for him. But not here yet. So that's kind of where we're leaving that for now. And now back to the battles. We like those. We win and good things happen. And we don't have to deal with the bummer of David sinning and people dying. So Joab, meanwhile, who's been doing what he's been supposed to be doing, has been meeting with great military success. They're ready to take the capital of the Ammonites, which is a big deal. And Joab, being faithful and loyal servant and relative of David, says, whoa guys, we're about to take this. We need David to come down and do it so he gets the credit for it, not me. Which is really quite a good thing on Joab's part. And it also kind of makes you wonder if Saul had been involved in some of those earlier campaigns of David and had gotten a little more credit. Instead of Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s, if there might have been a little less jealousy there. And maybe not saying David was showboating or trying to make a name for himself or anything. Saul definitely didn't want to be very involved, but then got jealous. This is just a whole different dynamic in terms of how the military relates to the king, because they know David is a military king, and he has certainly earned anything that comes to him in regards to getting credit for military victories over the years. But at any rate, so David goes down and they take the capital and tons of stuff, and it is a glorious and a very successful victory for the Israelites. This has been an overview of Lesson 15 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The United Kingdom of Israel, Foreshadowing the Reign of Christ the King. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.